As I'm currently writing a script for a full story explained for Kingdom Come Deliverance both 1 and 2, a provocative thought found its way into my head. From the very beginning, it's blatantly clear that nobles perceive themselves as inherently superior beings to commoners. Just look at the way that Sir Radzig and Istvan Toth carry themselves down to the way that they speak. Now, this is something that you will see throughout the entire journey, and it's one of the core points of contention underlining not just the game, but real life. The elite's belief is not merely just a matter of wealth or privilege, it's deeply rooted in psychological mechanisms that reinforce a rigid class hierarchy. You see, throughout history, those in positions of power have relied on cognitive biases, social identity formation, and ideological justifications to maintain their dominance. The 1% know how to breed their sheep so that they listen. And what's interesting is that if you look at modern day society, this is still happening. These psychological phenomena help to explain why nobles in the game and in medieval society more broadly viewed themselves as fundamentally different from and above common folk. I will also share ideas and discuss how and why the lower class are seemingly innately ready to be subservient. Raise your cup of wine to the like button if you found this academic conversation interesting, and hit that dislike button with a pitchfork if you don't. All engagement is engagement, and welcome to the psychology of nobles and commoners in
Kingdom Come Deliverance.
One of the most relevant psychological theories to explain noble superiority is the just world hypothesis, proposed by Melvin Lerner in 1980. Now, this theory suggests that people have a deep-seated need to believe that the world is fair and that individuals deserve their social standing, that it is simply out of their hands or responsibility, that how they are born is just what it is. Nobles, having been born into privilege, often see their power as a result of merit, divine favor, or the natural order, rather than historical chance or inherited advantage. This belief justifies their rule and reinforces the idea that commoners are poor and subservient because they inherently lack the qualities required for leadership. And what's crazy is that the elite really think that peasants aren't even really human. They're not equal. They think that they're incapable, that they're quite incapable of functioning without nobles being their shepherds. Now, in this way, the just world hypothesis allows nobles to rationalize their dominance while dismissing the struggles of the lower class as self-inflicted or deserved. And you see, this closely ties to the social identity theory, which explains how people derive a sense of self-worth from their group identity. Nobles, being part of the aristocratic class, innately see themselves as an in-group, separated from the commoners who form the out-group. This division fosters in-group favoritism, where nobles view each other as naturally superior beings and worthy of glorious respect, while commoners are seen as lesser beings. And you can actually see the social distinction being reinforced and perseverated through mannerisms and laws that regulate how to dress, how to speak, and how to carry yourselves, the behaviors that nobles have, ensuring that the noble identity remains distinct and unquestioned. I think it's also important to note that nobles were enabled and expected to be educated in a myriad of things, while commoners were purposely restricted and barred access to much of what the nobility had available to them. Just like in today's age, they purposely kept commoners uneducated because that would make them reliant on the noble class. That means peasants have to look upwards to them for direction, making it even easier for them to control the masses. But what about nobles who engage in cruel or exploitative behavior toward commoners? It goes beyond just being conditioned and raised to view others as less than and to not feel badly for them. To resolve this dissonance, nobles justify their actions by altering their own beliefs, convincing themselves that commoners are naturally lazy, ignorant, and unworthy of better treatment. Because when you can see others as less than human, it is easy to circumvent psychological discomfort. By dehumanizing the lower class, nobles reduce any moral conflict associated with their privilege and reinforce their perceived superiority. Moreover, beyond these psychological mechanisms, medieval society also provided religious and ideological vindications for noble supremacy. The concept of divine right of kings, which became widespread in medieval Europe, held that monarchs and noble families were appointed by God to rule over the land.
King Wenceslas is, by the will of God, the verbatim of all his subjects, not only the Christians.
And this belief was actually supported by the Catholic Church, who also loves power, which taught that the existing social hierarchy was part of God's divine plan. You see, questioning a noble's authority wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was heresy, the equivalent of questioning heaven itself. Through sermons, religious texts, and public ceremonies, the idea of noble supremacy was ingrained into the collective consciousness of medieval society, further reinforcing the psychological barriers between the classes. So you see, nobles not only saw themselves as superior, but genuinely believed that they were more deserving, more capable, and even more favored by God than a lower class Saiyan. This belief system wasn't merely simple arrogance or pride, it was a profoundly implanted worldview, ensuring that the bourgeoisie maintained its power without needing to question its legitimacy. But if nobles in Kingdom Come Deliverance believe that they are God's gift to Earth, then the natural question remains, why is it that commoners accept their place so easily? See, what you have to understand is all of this was not only reinforced through laws and military power, but also deeply embedded into the psychology of the lower classes as a whole. Fear, social conditioning, and learned behaviors played significant roles in ensuring that the vast majority of people never questioned their station in life. A critical psychological concept that helps explain this phenomenon is learned helplessness, first identified by Martin Seligman and Steve Meyer in their 1967 study on behavioral conditioning. In their experiments, dogs were exposed to electrical shocks in an environment where they had no means of escape. Eventually, after a number of trials, even when given an opportunity to avoid the shocks, the dogs remained passive, staying in their place, having learned that their resistance was futile. This effect applies to human psychology as well. When people experience repeated oppression or punishment with no ability to change their circumstances, they often stop trying altogether. Just like in Kingdom Come Deliverance, if you keep killing all the people and the guards in a city or at Trotsky Castle, even the guards will just start running away from you as soon as they see you, accepting the fact that you are a monster that can't be stopped, that there's no point in trying. Medieval commoners raised in a system that offered no realistic path to upward mobility may have experienced a similar psychological resignation. From birth, they were told that their place was to serve, and any defiance was met with severe consequences. Consequences? I forgot how to say consequences. Oh, there it is.
Consequences.
Reinforcing a cycle of submission. Fear also played a significant role in maintaining commoner obedience. The feudal system was structured around fear conditioning, a concept developed in behavioral psychology, particularly in the work of John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner in the 1920s at Johns Hopkins University. Their infamous Little Albert experiment demonstrated how fear could be artificially induced and associated with unrelated stimuli. In the study, a young child named Albert was exposed to a white rat, an animal he initially had no fear of. You can clearly see that the baby is indifferent, if only curious about that rat. However, in the next stage, Watson and Rayner paired the sight of the rat with a loud, frightening noise, banging a hammer against a bar right behind Albert's head. But that's not going to be shown here. After trials, over time, Albert developed a conditioned fear response, not just to the noise, but to the rat itself and even to other similar objects like a rabbit or a fur coat. You can even see poor baby Albert in distress as he tries to crawl away. This unfortunate abomination of an experiment showed how fear could be instilled and generalized. Generalized is a big thing here, a principle that medieval rulers likely benefited from, whether consciously or unconsciously. Commoners were conditioned to associate rebellion and defiance with brutal consequences, beatings, public executions, the pillory, exile, or even worse, torture. Just as Albert came to fear anything resembling a rat, peasants learned to fear not just punishment, but even the thought of resistance itself. The spectacle of executions and punishments in medieval towns was crucial for this conditioning. Feasting your eyes upon somebody getting flogged or hung wasn't just a form of justice, it was a warning to every onlooker. A warning that kept the nobles' heels on the commoners' necks so that there would never be insurrection. With this, it's easy to see that the fear extended beyond those who had directly defied authority and conditioned the entire community into submission. Unlike little Albert in the cruel and absolutely messed up experiment, who had the potential, or would have had the potential, to unlearn his fear response but was never deconditioned or followed up with and ended up dying at 6 years old due to excess buildup of fluid in his brain, commoners in medieval times were never presented within an environment where insurrection was safe. The constant reinforcement of authority through violence and spectacle was a strong deterrent and ensured that the fear response remained active across generations, making social obedience feel not just necessary, but natural. But beyond direct punishment, commoners were also subject to cultural and social indoctrination, and this reinforced their subservience. Pierre Bourdieu's theory of cultural capital explains how the dominant class controls not just economic and political structures, but also the cultural expectations that maintain their superiority. So, looking at this through medieval context, nobles and the church dictated education, religious beliefs, and even the way that language was used. Commoners were not just economically poor, but also deprived of cultural knowledge necessary to potentially even challenge their position. Again, look at modern society today. There is a reason why they don't teach Howard Zinn in history class, or teach us how to really use taxes and debt to accumulate wealth, and those are just a few things to name, because that knowledge is reserved only for the elite. The ability to read, for example, was a privilege reserved for nobles and clergy. If knowledge is power, then the deliberate restriction of knowledge ensured that commoners remained powerless. Additionally, the church played a critical role in keeping commoners in line. Religious teachings frame suffering as a virtue and obedience as a divine duty. Let that sink in. In the Bible, Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, there is the concept of the meek shall inherit the earth. And that reassured the poor that their suffering on earth would be rewarded in the afterlife, dissuading them from seeking material or political change. Because if they don't want that, the nobles and the men of the cloth get to have more of it. The doctrine of the three estates, which divided society into those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, positioned commoners as an essential yet unchangeable part of the divine order. Sir Hans Capon would even talk about this in the second game while at the tavern with Henry when he's explaining why he, as a noble, cannot do any labor.
I can't work, I'm a noble. I may not look much like a noble, but my blood's still blue. Henry, haven't you ever heard of the three states of man?
Would that be some aristocratic excuse?
Not so fast. It's God's law. Oratoris, the priests who pray for us. Laboratoris, the plebs who shovel shit and pay taxes. And Bellatoris, the warriors who protect the ones on their knees or in the fields. Carry sacks? That's against God and nature.
I understand. I'm in your service, so I'll carry all the sacks. Even your share.
And that's wild, that's crazy. But this religious reinforcement made questioning one's station an affront to God himself. This deeply embedded structure of obedience didn't just serve the interests of nobility, it made the entire system function with remarkable stability. While peasant revolts and uprisings did occur throughout medieval history, they were rare and often crushed with overwhelming force. The psychological and cultural forces at play ensured that, for most people, submission was the default state, not because they lacked the will to change, but because the world had conditioned them to see no alternative. It was a beast of a system that kept itself going, where both sides, whether they realized it or not, played a role in maintaining the order of things. People obey authority, the economy keeps wealth in noble hands, and laws and traditions make sure that nothing changes. And this wasn't just about force, it was about shaping people's beliefs and conditioning them so that they accept the world as is. Just like so many trauma victims who are abused, they are taught and conditioned to believe that their abuse and mistreatment is normal, and so that is what they learn to expect and accept. One of the most famous psychological experiments that helps explain this is Stanley Milgram's obedience study of 1963. This was actually even a study heavily referenced when Nazi soldiers were being studied to understand why they committed their horrific acts in World War II. Now, Milgram wanted to see how far people would go when ordered to do something harmful. In the experiment, volunteers were told to give what they thought were real electrical shocks to another person. Even when they heard screams of pain, which, by the way, were fake, most kept going because an authority figure told them to. Milgram's research showed that people will follow orders from somebody they see as powerful, somebody in a position of perceived power, even if it goes against their own morals. Beyond psychology, the structure of money, land, and law ensured that the 1% stayed rich while the commoners remained poor, which that in of itself creates another slew of issues psychologically for the commoners and the nobility. But the system bound peasants to the land, making social mobility nearly impossible. Even when serfdom declined, sumptuary laws, which are laws that controlled what different classes could wear, eat, and buy, ensured that commoners couldn't imitate nobility, reinforcing what the elite deemed to be order. But this pattern isn't unique to medieval times. Throughout history, those in power used every tool available: fear, law, wealth, education, and psychology to maintain control. But something else that tickled my pickle was how the game invited me to slaughter hordes of humans throughout Kingdom Come. It did not matter if you were a peasant, noble, soldier, or a man of the cloth. My sword was rated E for everyone. Am I a madman for being so violent? I was feeling quite hungry, but I can't be the only one, otherwise why would the devs put it in the game? So, if you want to learn about the psychology of violence in video games, click the next video on the screen.